This is Henry Chamberlain. I will be speaking with Glen Head, who's a master cartoonist of the post-comics underground. And so I want to just do a little formality here and thank you, Glen, for doing this.
Well, sure, man. Thanks a lot for having me on. See you later. Yeah, it's wonderful to be on. Thanks very much, Henry.
And as we were just saying before we actually started, that I have a little bit of an advantage over some of the guys who do these interviews, that I can write about them, and I regularly write about them. A lot of guys just do the interview, which is fine. But I was just saying that I did that to get my head in gear and to get my thoughts together. And it's a great exercise. I recommend everybody do some of that.
Yeah, I can see that. As I was saying, I really appreciate everything you wrote. It seemed like you really got the book, and that really means a lot to me. I mean, one thing I'll say is that I've been very pleased with the response to the book, which has been uniformly very positive, which is wonderful. But when I read a really well articulated, well thought out review of my work, and in that case, it was really going over not just Chartwell Manor, my new book, but also the last one, and really taking apart both of them. That's really what I would hope for, because you know, it's a very ambitious book, and Chartwell Manor, and so yeah, it meant a lot to me that you put that much into it and wrote a really good piece on it. So yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. We're both of more or less the same generation, and we have a lot of, I'm sure we have a lot of common interest. I will just rattle off a few things like life in the big city. I came from Houston, from the South, Louisiana, and I grew up in Houston, went to school there, and I'd never gone to New York. And then finally in the late 80s, I made my first trip out, and it just blew my mind, because it's so, the word's overused, gritty, so real.
Right.
And they'd lost my, the airlines had lost my luggage. So I just had the shirt on my back to add a little extra drama to it. And I was staying at the YMCA to even add a little bit more grit. Oh, it's a great.
The one on 23rd Street?
The one on 92nd.
Oh my.
Oh, that's,
who knows what that was like, man.
Well, that's, I've never gone to one of their talks, but it's like it's a hybrid. It's a place it's a YMCA, of course, and it's also a literary center. So you got all these writers that do their lectures there and stuff. So I didn't get to taste that part. I got like the scrappiest room possible, and it was a little scary. It was like a prison cell. But anyway, that was a great introduction to New York, especially in the late 80s. But I want to jump in, and like you were saying, that I did my best to get to the meat of the book. And I'm going to jump over here to which perhaps is the meatiest, one of the meatiest pages in the book, page 95, which I categorize I in my notes as the parental denial page. One of the parental denial pages, maybe the most denial going on. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a good choice of page. Where do I start with this? I mean, I really got into kind of the simplicity of some of the graphics of it, in terms of using the graphics to express what was happening in that moment. Particularly the silent panel, which is the second to last panel on the page, which is very designy, but it also has a sense of some sort of smoldering oiliness, was how I think of it. You know, it looks like black smoke maybe, or black oil has been, you know, has risen up from the discontent of my character and my mother's character, after we've really just had it out over her unwillingness to look at what has gone on in my life up to that point. This is at this point, I'm at age 17, and she has exploded on me and said, "What good will it do? Forget it. The past doesn't own you. I refuse to let it own me." And it's a very, as you say, a denial-based kind of page. And it's one of those confrontations that doesn't end with any kind of resolution, except that there is no resolution. And my character walking off the last panel saying, "I really don't know, Ma, but stay out of my room." And so it's that kind of teenage rage
Yeah.
that, I don't know, I think probably a lot of 17-year-olds can relate to. And I was trying to depict the frustration on both characters' parts, because what brought this argument into fruition was my character wanting to use pornography, which he has hidden, stashed in his closet, and his mom having found it, so they're having it out over it. So the pornography is kind of the subtext to the historical context of my character having been in boarding school, and the twisted sexuality that happened there. And, confronting one's parents about sex related matters is obviously never an easy thing. So, but that's the first of the times that it happens in the book. And I'm glad you chose it. It's it's in a way maybe my favorite chapter in the book, the point at which my character has been out of boarding school and is beginning to really look at it, and beginning to
Yeah.
feel the, aftermath and what it meant.
Sometimes I find it's hard to pinpoint a page. I almost feel like I repeat this a lot to folks. You just have to read the whole thing. You have to immerse yourself in it. But then
Right.
there are times when you can find a page and pin something down. The thing that I'm thinking of is that it's difficult to pin down in just one page. You have to be there. You have to read it. Is the fact of the things that are said and unsaid. And are we on the same page? That kind of feeling, that frustrating feeling that a teenager has, and a parent who
Yeah.
doesn't want to confront, and maybe by not confronting it is an accomplice in a way to what's going on.
Uh, yeah. I mean, my character had to confront it, though. I mean, that's really what this is about. Is
Yeah,
the waking up to that, having to do that. Uh,
yeah.
where he's now got to bring it up to both his mother and father, and they need to really face it, and they need to face it on his terms, as opposed to the ones that they would like to face it on. They would like to keep it on their terms, and he can't have that. And so that's the beginning of, a kind of explosion, which happens later in the chapter. I don't know if you're going to get to that, but it was another thing that I really enjoyed drawing in this chapter, was the kind of hardcore partying thing that closes out this chapter, and cuts the book off for about 10 years before you get back to where he is at about 10 years later, in the 80s.
I don't go further into this chapter because I've bitten off quite a lot. I'm trying to
Okay. Sure.
encapsulate your whole career to a certain extent and just do justice to everything. I named these
Right.
next 3 pages "Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll" just to
Right.
give me some places to hook some thoughts into. Now, here's maybe an example of where, and oh, there's some million things I could say. Like, I feel it's a tragedy, or tragedy is not even quite the right word, but a boy and his coming of age, sexuality, a girl too, of course, or anybody. You have to be careful how you say things these days, but just as
Right.
your sexuality, should be something that you can completely enjoy, and for it to be tainted or to be just taken into a completely horrible direction is just is something that I'm inspired that you were able to find the fortitude and the wisdom to persevere, to overcome that, or maybe to even somehow see it for what it was, even at that age, to have
Yeah.
have that wisdom to know that you're going to move beyond it.
Well, yeah. Thanks. I have a lot of feelings about this page and about the stuff you're talking about. Some of them are complicated. See, one thing that you see on this page, if you look on the left, around the middle, on the far left, is a book by Bukowski, Factotum, right?
Okay.
And I had my time of like kind of being inspired to live like that, and inspired to do work that grew out of that. And then this isn't a dig at Bukowski because I still admire him, but one thing I can be a little critical of with his work, he doesn't dig that deep, you know. Um, it's kind of fast times with an alcoholic, as opposed to, well, why are you an alcoholic? And sometimes he goes into it. It can be, you know, the bad skin condition he had as a teenager, but he doesn't go into it too much. It's mainly just a fun romp. And the reason I bring all this up is because I've done a fair bit of that kind of fun romp stuff. And what this book was really about, and this chapter in particular, was trying to peel that back a little bit and showing what was the correlation, if not the causality, but also the causality, which was my boarding school years. And so I'm really into drawing a panel like this, you know, and this is actually one of 2 pages, it's a 2-page spread of New York City at its grimiest, you know, and where all the different art forms that inspire me. And that would include some of Drew Friedman's Times Square drawings, and it would also include Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets and Taxi Driver. And I can bring all that in, I can bring that to bear on a page like this, yet at the same time, I can make it personal. And that's what I really want to do. See, I want to be able to go for the cinematic, the exciting, which this page was intended to be. You can tell just by the camera angle that I'm trying to wow you with a lot of montagey stuff,
Yeah.
a la, you know, Scorsese or something like that. So I want that movie excitement, but I'm also really trying to get you to feel for my character. So that's what's really interesting to me, is to try to have it both ways, because I'm not looking to do just a deeply personal tale. And I definitely don't want to be boring. And that's one thing I don't want autobiography to be, but I want it to mean something. But again, I want some oomph to it, which, you know, hopefully I got, you know. So I mean, I can do all these things and I can like expose myself and make myself vulnerable, as long as I can turn the whole thing into a movie, you know. That's an important key here, especially when I look at a page like this, that it'd be a movie.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sorry that I chose one page,
Oh,
not
that's okay.
the whole spread. For this one, I did the whole spread. Well,
Right.
it just seemed like you couldn't
Yeah.
avoid
Yeah,
that.
I can see that. I can see that. Um, yeah, this was an interesting drawing to do, um, for a lot of reasons. First of all, I just have a lot of fun drawing stuff like this. I mean, it's crazy to go crazy, and it's fun to go crazy and just go for like pure cartoony apeshit design, which
Yeah.
is what this is. And this drawing was also done with a few different things in mind. Like, I knew that in the strip, I was going to be showing this to my friend Mark Newgarden and getting a reply from him. And that's what follows this drawing. And his reply is sort of equivocating. And he's like, it's okay, I guess. I just think the best comics by Glen Head are going to be comics about Glen Head, which is a very sort of, Mark Newgarden kind of proclamation. And I have this drawing here in relation to that statement because sometimes in comics, what I've wanted to do is just pure energy, pure excitement, pure zazz. And that can be a lot of fun. And this two-page drawing was a lot of fun to draw. I think it's fun to look at. It's not making a statement. And this is actually kind of, in a way, about that. It's just pure excitement, pure energy, pure zazz. And that's also me looking at that and thinking, so is this all there is? Is this all you want to do? Is this where you're going with your work? You know? And
Mm-hmm.
again, it's the thing of like, I want to have it as many ways as possible because I do want to have this kind of fun. I do want to have this kind of imagistic excitement, but I also want to be telling my story, you know? So, yeah.
And then this one is very interesting. This is the rock and roll page. It
Yeah,
demonstrates some of the wonderful artistry going on in Chartwell Manor. The recurring motif of the Rolling Stone cover.
right.
It's it also tucked away back here.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is too. And I was
Other
actually using
places.
that octagon shape there too. If you go back to that page, the one you just had of the street scene. Um, See, it's also on the factotum cover there, that same shape, as well as on these peep show booth tokens that they used to have at Peepland. You hand them $1 and they'd give you 4 of those tokens.
I see.
And that's what they look like. I got some on eBay. So yeah, I was reiterating that shape. Uh, it occurs some other times in the book too, but yeah, I was doing that because yeah, that the book starts off with that Rolling Stones album cover, and I had it as a kid, and I had that album before going to Chartwell Manor, and that was where I first heard, the song "Jumpin' Jack Flash" quite often. And before going to that school, I was struck by that line because I knew there could and would be corporal punishment. The line, I was schooled with a strap right across my back.
Mm.
And so that page you just were at, that's kind of a montage page, shows my character thinking that over, you know, that if you want to go back to that page, yeah, the next one, there we are. Um, it's kind of, it just shows him thinking it over, he's thinking about it. He pulls out that record, he looks at the album cover, and he's thinking about that stuff because he's now experienced some of that stuff that's on that record, you know? So it's just kind of a moody scene of him being lost and looks kind of sad, kind of contemplative as he is sitting there looking at Cycle Tunes, I think it is, which is one of those comics from back then that I'm sure I had, and just doing the things that he did at that time that I did. You know, drawing Roach T-shirt designs, and that was sort of my entryway into cartooning was trying to copy those T-shirt designs.
Now, I had meant to say this at the very beginning, and I think, well, people are going to watch the video. Maybe they'll stop at a certain point. So I want to say it now that the class action suit to the survivors of Chartwell Manor is still open, and it goes on
Correct.
till November 30th. And anyone
Right.
listening to this who is a survivor, you can definitely file. And just if you make it easy on yourself, just go to the New York Post story about Chartwell Manor,
Right.
and they
Right.
cover it deeply. And I just feel that's so important to just say right now, and I will make sure to say it again. Um, Now, I think the New York Post did an incredibly good job
Yeah.
The guy who wrote the piece, very insightful about graphic novels in general and about your
Yeah.
work. And so
Yeah. I was impressed too.
that to me is an
Yeah.
indicator of
Yeah.
something
I thought he
good.
did a really good job. What were you going to say?
Well, I think that's an indicator of something really good, that people do get it more often than one might think.
Yeah.
They
Yeah. I
do
agree.
they
I
do
agree.
get the nuances. And I think of the New York Post as a tabloid, and I think it that's part of its voice, part of its charisma, part of its brand, but it can be done with an artful, thoughtful sensibility too. Like it can be
Yeah.
put in there because it's for the average guy, but the average guy, he wants some lofty thoughts now and then with his tuna sandwich, or why not?
Right. I know. I know. I was very happy to see that. Um,
But
wow.
I wanted to throw this in because you had mentioned this is being one of your influences,
Yeah.
Pascal Dury, if I'm
Pascal Dury.
pronouncing.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I thought this was a pretty good example. I don't know what
Yeah.
I don't know where this comes from. I just sort of lifted it.
Okay. I think I've probably got a copy of this uh, myself. Yeah. I've always found this artist's work very thrilling and exciting and disturbing all at once. And yeah, it really inspired me at various times when I was doing Chartwell Manor. I think one of the things I really like about it is it encapsulates a lot of the excitement that cartooning can have. In fact, the big 2-page spread that you just showed, I was thinking of his work while I was doing it, just that kind of off the wall crazy energy that I find inspiring. Although this isn't what I would think of as psychedelic, um, which my work can veer into when I start doing work like that. Um, but the thing about this work, we looked at it when I was at Art Spiegelman's class in the 80s, and the work had a very disturbing sexual element to it that I can recall. I think it may have been called Theodore Deathhead, the name of the comic. And it was this scratchboard style that showed some young guy of indeterminate age, I think, having a sexual encounter. And as the strip progressed, you had these crazy 2-page spreads that were kind of psychedelic, but very realistic because they showed a lot of real objects like machine guns and ironing boards and rolling pins, you name it, sort of in an explosive state. And the explosion of it really felt very orgasmic
Mm.
in a way that this to me also feels kind of orgasmic. In some cases, he'll have sexual imagery right in there mixed in it as well, but it will have the disturbing feel of a sexual encounter, possibly an unwanted one, and the sort of bruising excitement that that sexual encounter might have. This is my own interpretation, but I don't think I'm far off because it's definitely got this disturbing sex thing happening, and it's got kids in it a lot of the time. And the art is magnificent. And so it's not, strictly speaking, for the most part, what I'd call comics. It doesn't really operate on that level so much, but it has a kind of brutalist excitement that I find I'm very drawn to it, and I feel a kinship to it, I suppose. You know.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say you wouldn't necessarily consider this comics, because there's always that discussion, an ongoing discussion of where do you draw the line? Are comics art? And I say yes to a certain kind, the kind that you make, the auteur cartoonist. Let's go ahead and decide this, guys. Yes, that falls under art. The comics
Mhm.
medium has art to offer the public. Spider-Man, I don't think he falls under the category of art. but you know, maybe there have been. I think Farrell Dalrymple did a great one, but that was Omega the Unknown. And there, you know, there've been crossovers and stuff, but I digress.
Okay. Yeah.
And I just wanted to show some of your paintings, just give
Okay.
people a little taste of your paintings. And here's a
Sure.
recurring motif of the snowman. I noticed that he was called Bob at one point and Sam at another.
Yeah, yeah. Then it got changed. There was some sort of minor court case because I didn't invent the character, and
Oh,
but I really altered it and tweaked it and reworked it. And while that happened, we were friends. And then by the time Weirdo wanted to print it, we weren't. And so I ran into some trouble, and I ended up changing the name ultimately. So it was unfortunate. Drawing snowmen in this context was fun because you could bring in some element of cuteness. It's almost got like a Robert Crumb vibe to it because, you know, Crumb's characters have that kind of roundness and cuteness. And I see this as sort of, you know, Crumb influenced in a funny way, you know.
yeah,
I was really into when I was first looking at Crumb, you know, one of the things that really blew my mind about it and really inspired me was how he could draw sidewalks, which is a weird thing, but like he did this strip called Street Corner Days, which is about speed freaks. It was printed in the third issue of Zap, and it just blew my mind the way he was capable of drawing these characters standing around on the sidewalk, and he had a great sense of perspective and space. And when he did that, and I saw it, I was kind of like, I got to do that. I got to be able to draw that kind of thing. So I was very drawn to it, and I love drawing city scenes just for having people standing around on sidewalks and making that world believable, making it a world that you feel you could walk around in, which is also what this drawing's about, you know?
well, it's interesting how I compare New York when I was dewy-eyed and young and impressionable, and New York more recently. And I'm still in love with New York. I guess as a middle-aged guy, um, inconveniences creep in, and uh, comparisons to what was then, what is now. So it does take away from the magic, and then you can revert back to movies. It's interesting how it's not enough. The actual city cannot be enough. Sometimes you need to enhance it with the memories of movies or
Oh yeah,
art.
yeah,
Enhances life as it
right.
should.
And there's also that thing about New York looks really good in movies, but I don't know that anybody would really want to have it back what they had. You know what I mean? What New York was like. I mean, you came here in the early, no, you said late 80s,
Yeah,
and that really would have been like a culture shock, you know. It was kind of a thing for me when I was first going to SVA, and then I dropped out, and then I came back, and I was living on the Lower East Side, you know, 11th and B during like the very early 1980s, and it was just about the most dangerous place on earth is what it felt like. And it
oh
it
yeah.
sure seemed like it. So I can imagine that what you saw when you came here in the late 80s wasn't really uh, any joyride either. I mean, it was definitely a dangerous place, and nobody could ever see it existing differently. And you know, this itself was taken also from a lot of different photos of different places. Like that body rub parlor was a place that existed, and I really loved the sign. And yeah, just the feeling of that, and like that Knox Hats place and chock full of nuts, which was, you know, that was kind of ubiquitous forever, you know. So
I made a handful of excursions in my youth to New York, and one I can't remember now where I was staying, but it was a really ratty place with a bunch of bunk beds. It was some sort of not a bed and breakfast. I can't remember now, but wasn't it was I guess it was in the Lower East Side, and they kept telling me don't go into Alphabet City at night, and
right,
I
right.
didn't go. Maybe I should have. I
I don't
like
know, man. You might
I
not
like
be here if you did.
I like a little, just a little taste of danger and being very careful and then walking away when you sense something's.
Sure, man.
But anyhow, I think you can still do that a
Yeah, well,
little
that's
bit.
why I say.
You can still do that a little
Sorry.
bit. You can still do that a little bit, of course. Certain areas like in the Bowery still have that character. But everything's just been so gentrified and scrubbed clean that it's hard to find that.
Totally.
I hope you don't mind my imposing. I'll just throw in a few more painting examples. I love
No,
this.
man, not at all.
I
Not
love
at
this
all.
one.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed doing psychedelic Dick Tracy Futurama type drawing, painting. Uh, I'd like to do another. You know, I've got this idea for this painting called Chester Gould's Crack House Vision, where he's in a crack den smoking crack, and he's just lost his mind, and surrounding him is this out of control crime scene of all his characters together. And this is as close to that, but yeah, it's really a lot of fun doing Dick Tracy and just going nuts with it. You know, because the strip was already nuts. I mean, the thing
Yeah.
that is best about Dick Tracy, I think, isn't even Dick Tracy. It's the fact that that was mainstream fare, and that, you know, people would read that for entertainment and be okay with it. You know, because like it's just almost impossibly violent. You know, the brutality of just the line work alone and the graphics, let alone the stuff that would go on. Like this, my favorite is the spike machine, which was this torture device that the brow, uh, he ends up getting put in it, and it's just so sick that you could have this like electric torture device, you know, this medieval type scene in daily papers, and that was just, you know, all good.
Oh, yeah. Well, kids would eat it up, of course, without saying. That goes without
Yeah,
saying. Um,
yeah, and also just the fact that like strips like that were serial type strips. They were serialized tales, and that's like an older aspect of comics that I didn't grow up with. You know, the first comic I ever read was Peanuts, you know, and that was just one of those 4-panel gag strips. Sometimes they'd have an ongoing narrative, but basically the ongoing narrative thing, uh, that fell by the board from syndicated comics a while back, you know, and it was mainly, you know, I think of comic book narrative as the thing, as opposed to comic strip narrative, you know? Um, like in
yeah.
doing Chartwell Manor, like I really think about that in terms of the overarching narrative of the book, much more than like, I don't know, kind of jokes or joke telling that the comics I read growing up had, you know?
Well, I had a lot of differences with my dad, who I love. He's passed away, but one of his gifts, and he didn't think much of it, or maybe he did. I don't know. He introduced me to Milton Caniff and Terry and the Pirates,
Yeah.
so I totally absorbed that. And for the life of me, when I was a kid, the number one thing I wanted to do was do a comic strip, and a lot of young kids today still want to do them. Of course, web comic strips, but I had one in the school paper, and it's got to the point where it was so slick and well done that there was some interest in it by the local newspaper that's in Houston, and I wanted to turn away from it because I thought very delusional of myself. Oh, if I ever get picked up by a comic strip, I'll be stuck. That's all I'll ever do. I want to back away from that because it was fine arts that I was mostly interested in. So, back
Wow.
then I was thinking, I really want to eventually do long comics. Uh,
Hmm.
I was aware of graphic novels. I had made one trip out to Europe, and I became aware of all the bandy dessinée going on,
Okay.
and then Chester Brown, or I don't know. I picked up pretty early, but I didn't know what to do with it.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, so there's such a completely, it's a world of difference between a comic strip and then short form comics and then
Oh yeah.
graphic novels.
Yeah, completely. Completely. I've really picked up on that a lot in the past decade or so that I've been involved in graphic novels. And it wasn't something that I anticipated going into specifically, although I kind of knew that Chartwell Manor would have to be a graphic novel. I tried doing it a couple of times in various forms, and it just wasn't getting where it needed to go. And I think I knew that something that had that much to it, that much content, couldn't really be simplified or, with brevity made into a shorter kind of piece. It was going to really require what I was able to do, which was have a lot of different decades of my life in the story, and that was really required. It just wouldn't have worked as a strip. And I think, you know, I think we work up to the work that we have to do. Like, because I remember, I mentioned going to SVA and studying with Art Spiegelman, and it was interesting hearing him and seeing him show on the slides the original 3-page version of Mouse versus the graphic novel, which was actually 2 volumes, how they differed and what he was able to do in one case versus the other. And in the other, meaning both those volumes, an enormous amount of depth and detail and thought was going on in those pages about the characters, Artie and Vladek. And so you become aware of this, and by studying it, because we really did study it. It was like a teaching tool when I was at SVA. You become aware of all the different things that a comic can do if you really apply yourself to it. I also just think that it's enormously demanding. It's an enormously demanding task to take on a graphic novel. That's going to be especially true with something like Chartwell Manor because of the emotional impact it is going to have on you if you're going to draw that. So you have to be ready for that. But also just in terms of having the chops, the skills to work on something long form and keep your act together. Because, anybody that draws comics usually finds that it's really hard to do this. And it's a lot more work to do an 8-page comic than a 6-page comic. And so multiply that by over 100 pages, you're talking about a lot of work. So you need to have a pretty strong skill set. You have to kind of be at the top of your game to really do it well. I have to think. I'm amazed by people that like haven't drawn comics before and they decide they're going to draw a graphic novel. Like, you must be out of your mind. I wouldn't do it if I didn't feel like I'd had a lot of stuff under my belt that I thought, well, I guess I'm ready.
Yeah, I can appreciate a person wanting to do that. They don't. They probably don't realize what they're. Be careful what you wish for, and even if you wish for it, that doesn't mean it's
Right.
going to happen. And then
Right.
this painting fits in with Chartwell Manor, of course.
Right. Right. This one in particular, it's me and my parents is the title, and yeah, it's kind of primitive, this painting and handling of paint, but something nice about it. Sort of shows me or some version of me looking out at the future and seeing what it has to offer, and it's obviously taking place on some island, and my dad is holding on to my left pinky and my mom is holding on to my dad's hand, and they're sort of strange midgets. And yeah, I'm this weird electrified psychedelic character who's like in a state of some kind, looking at what's out there that awaits him. So yeah, I mean, you're always working out the same stuff. You're just working it out in different ways. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So this is sort of the psychedelic painted version of Chartwell Manor, I suppose.
you had said in one interview that you need to focus on one project at a time. When do you find time for your paintings?
Yeah.
If you're going to be doing project,
Oh, I basically,
if you're doing project A, let's
sorry?
say if you're doing project A, your graphic novel that you're doing now, wouldn't you find it therapeutic, not therapeutic, but
Yeah.
relaxing to be able to go over to an easel and work on a painting for a while and then come back to the graphic novel? Or does that not work for you? Or
It would if I did it. Although I guess what I'll say is that when I got into doing these paintings, it was as a result of not doing comics and deciding, yeah, okay, that's it. And that, in fact, I found out is not just a good thing, but fairly common and happens to a lot of cartoonists, because the thing about drawing comics is that it's not, as you noted, the most satisfying art form to work in from a purely creative standpoint, like, say, working in a sketchbook or painting, which is in fact what I ended up doing when I sort of came to the end of the line with the comics I was doing in the mid to late 90s. And I needed a break. And what actually led to that was I was attempting to do a comic book, Chartwell Manor, and I had done about 3 or 4 pages, and I knew it wasn't working, so I had to put it aside. Now, the thing that's kind of interesting about that was that the the drawing in it was still heavily influenced by a cartoonist who's kind of a mentor of mine, Kim Deitch.
yeah,
And I could see that this just wasn't going to cut it. So I stopped and I just worked in the sketchbook and painted. And the sketchbook is really an excellent tool when you've been doing comics a long time. And it was definitely the best thing I could have done then, because what it really got me to do was just experiment with the brush. And after that, my work became much more brush focused in terms of a kind of, I don't know how you would describe it, not looseness, but a certain kind of grungy expressiveness, which you start getting with the brush when you use it. You can't, unless you're Charles Burns or somebody, you can't really control the brush that perfectly. It kind of wants to do what it wants to do. So for me, it was the best thing I could have done, because it loosened me up a bit and kept me from aiming for kind of perfection. Because when you're working with the repeatograph, which is what I had been doing, there's a tendency for it, right? And the brush can see to kind of loosen you a bit. So,
yeah.
that psychedelic drawing that we looked at, that 2-page spread thing, that's actually, it's very brushy. And it was the end result of taking this break. So it's a good thing to do. I mean, the thing about comics is that it's very performative. You are really getting up on stage and you are like trying to entertain the troops, man. That is really what it's about. You want a round of applause, you want to get booked the following night for your next comic, all that kind of shit. That really goes on with comics, right? That's just such a
Mhm.
thing. As a cartoonist, as a comic book artist, you are always an entertainer. You can be doing other things, but you are always an entertainer. That's okay, but it's not necessarily that good for you creatively, in terms of just not giving a shit. You know what I mean? And it's
Yeah.
pretty important that you can cultivate that attitude of not giving a shit. I don't care if people see this. I don't care if they like it, blah, blah, blah. And you never have that attitude with a comic. With a comic, you always want people to see it. Somebody said this once, that nobody ever drew a comic book or a comic to shove in their drawer and not show anybody. See, it's
Mhm.
like, it's essential to it. It's like, it's really this exhibitionist kind of medium. You know what I mean? It's like trying to get the spotlights on it. So, um, but yeah, I found this out, that various cartoonists at certain points, for whatever reasons, usually some kind of pressure, either external or internal, gets to be too much, or you come to the end of the line with particular ideas that you had, and you don't want to be a hack. At least I don't. And so, I just go with what my gut tells me to do, which for a little while was paintings. And yeah, I enjoyed doing them. And a lot of this imagery ends up finding its way back into the work, the comics that you do anyway.
Oh yeah,
You
exactly.
know,
Well, it's also interconnected. Some cartoon people who are labeled cartoonists, you don't know what they're doing when they're by themselves at night. Maybe they're also a frustrated novelist or an aspiring novelist or a painter that just
right.
just
Sure.
took a detour. I think of Julie Doucet. That's somebody who, in her heart, she always wanted to push things, push, and then she pushed her way into fine art. And I don't think she's
Mhm.
ever looked back. But there's so many examples of that. I won't.
Right.
I don't have too many more slides, but I have one of one cartoonist who made the. Well, there's Skip Williamson. That's an example. I could rattle off names if I start thinking about it. But David Sandlin was one that I was going to uh, come up oh, come up to in a second. I just have a few more
Okay.
images here. This one I think is hilarious, very nicely balanced.
Well, thanks.
And then
Um,
oh, it's hard not to comment.
yeah. Yeah, a lot of this was just having fun. These were cartoon characters that I had used in various comics, and some of it was like just seeing what I could do with paint and seeing what I could do with a big image like that. I mean, it's very freeing to work with just an image that doesn't have to point towards something. I mean, with comics,
Yeah,
basically no one image is the deal. It's the totality of all those images and the idea and the story and all that shit, and then how it printed and everything it's a lot like filmmaking almost, very much like filmmaking, really. And doing a painting, it's just a painting, you know?
yeah.
So you can just play with color and design cartoon characters and just have a go at it.
I was curious about your process because here's one that's a work in process. Now, is
Right.
this the beginning of a painting? Do you do it all in a line work and then paint over the lines, or how does it
Well,
work for you?
in this case, it's going to be colored in Photoshop, because those other ones, like the other color ones that you showed, were done with gouache. But
Okay.
yeah, this is going to be colored with in Photoshop. I think all the other ones that you've shown so far, I was just working in paint. But yeah, this sort of whack job cartoon, this sort of apocalypse, uh, Esbo's 17th annual atomic chicken run, which just an ape shit drawing, just having a lot of fun with it. And this is a
Yeah.
good example of what I mentioned earlier about brushwork and just how you can kind of loosen up and get really crazy with cartooniness. And I've definitely done that here.
Well, it's beautiful.
Thank
Now
you.
I have a few more. Avenue D, of course, was a landmark piece of work.
Thanks.
And of course, so much has been said about the Muhammad Ali story, which another iteration of it is in Chicago.
Yeah.
That's something I wanted to
Yeah.
chat with you a bit about, taking one story and then redoing it. And that's something that could be a really great lesson for cartoonists that, hey, you did it once, no problem. You could do it again.
Yeah. There's a couple of things relating to that. One, I already mentioned Mouse, that it originally was a 3-page strip, and then it
Yeah.
became the graphic novel that it did. This is also a 3-page strip. But yeah, the other thing I relate it to, um, it's actually one of those things that novelists sometimes do. You could see where there's a correlation between you do all these different comics, right? That are like essentially kind of like short stories, but then you realize that there's something in the content of that short story that could be expanded on. And that's that's what's really exciting about the graphic novel for me. One of the main things is that See, my whole education as a comic book artist and cartoonist was, okay, what's essential, and get rid of everything else that isn't. And that kind of editing process, putting things between the panels, is really important for, say, a strip like this, because it really is only about me meeting Muhammad Ali, right?
Yeah.
But on the street when I'm homeless and crazy. But looking at it, it couldn't not gnaw away at me. Like, what if I did that whole story about when I was homeless and crazy and in Chicago and met Muhammad Ali? And that's just a featured vignette in the book. And
Yeah.
so that kind of planted that seed that this whole thing could be opened up, and you could make the whole thing about my character at that point in his life. And that began to really fascinate me, because um, one of my favorite books from a while back was this George Orwell book, Down and Out in Paris and London.
Oh, I love that.
And
Yeah.
yeah, it's a great book, and it really reminded me when I read it, kind of almost repressed memory of what it had been like when I was in Chicago. And the book was very potent, and the experience that I'd had was very strong. And it really intrigued me, the idea of trying to draw what that experience feels like, the experience of being on the streets and hungry. And hunger is really quite an experience if you've never had it. It's not something you forget. It really stays with you. So it was an interesting creative assignment to attempt to draw that, because all you've got to go on is your own experience of what it felt like, which is always a good thing for a cartoonist, always a good thing for somebody who has grown up, as most cartoonists will, looking at a lot of comics. So you're not deriving from some other cartoonist's approach when you're drawing what it feels like to be hungry. You're just drawing your own experience. So that can help you dive deep into your own voice, which I think was what happened in turning this 3-page strip into a book, because it allowed me to dive really deep into that time. And yeah, I believe it really helped me to find my voice. A lot of people reacted to that book in that way, that I had at last found my voice with that book, because it wasn't with autobiography. The thing that's great about it is you can't hide behind other things too much, not if you're doing it right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can't hide behind somebody else's style. You can't hide behind formal gimmickry if you're being honest and doing it as you experienced it. So it was something that we had to do when we were first at SVA, when I was there in the early 80s. And it was something that I wasn't specifically attracted to, but it was something that I always got a good reaction to my work from doing comics about, like when I lived on the Lower East Side on 11th and B, I did a lot of comics about that. And it was a good entree into that world of drawing comics. It was a good way in.
I'm being very mindful of the time, so I just have a few more things to play with. I wanted to. This was one that I really wanted to talk a little bit about. Chicago. Reading that, I think, oh, how unfair. You got yourself depicted as homeless and crazy, but nobody knows what's triggering all that. And then so Chartwell Manor
Right.
finally comes out. And what's interesting is, well, why didn't he say it in Chicago? Well, I think what it boils down to is what's in Chicago is what's in Chicago, and what's in Chartwell Manor is what's in Chartwell Manor, and the two couldn't
Right.
be together. They're two separate books. Not to confuse newcomers. Gateway is Chartwell Manor. Go ahead, dive in, but you're going to have an even richer experience if you ask Chicago.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I felt like they had to be freestanding, so to speak. That like um, the way I really look at it is that I think with memoir, the idea for me is to peel the onion more with each book. And I don't think I could have done Chartwell Manor, first of all, because I hadn't done a graphic novel yet. So I as well schooled in the process of it. But I wasn't ready to go that deep. And I also wasn't sure if people would be able to take it. So Chicago was kind of the way of really diving into that deep end for the first time. But Chicago doesn't go as deeply into personal motivations and uh, what's going on underneath the behavior, which is what Chartwell Manor is really in a lot of ways about. You know, you're seeing my character do the crazy things that he does in Chicago, but you're not completely sure why. Some of it just has to do with the whole idea of being an underground cartoonist and, hey, go on the road, see what happens. What's the worst that could happen? It's almost like that kind of mindset.
Yeah.
Whereas with Chartwell Manor, um, all the craziness that happens, it's all got this subtext from the first chapter. So you know, whether my character knows it or not, that a lot of his behavior is driven by those experiences. You can't know for sure how much, but it's obvious that some has. There has definitely been an effect on one's life, on my character's life, by being in that boarding school. And then you see it play out, you know, throughout the following chapters.
Now I'll just show Bob the Snowman really quick here,
Mhm.
and then Classy Gator.
Yeah, sort of wish fulfillment comics, you know, done with funny animals, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
it just seemed a natural for a reptilian character to be a pimp.
it did. It worked. It seemed like the right thing, you know. It seemed like, you know, that if you think about it, I guess, not that I did at the time, but you know, the way an alligator hunts, it waits for something and then it pulls it underwater and eats it. So that's
Yeah.
like a pimp over there at like whatever that bus station was that the pimps used to meet the teenage girls that just showed up from the Midwest and try to drag them under, you know, it's like
Mm.
that.
And then Snake Eyes, of course, which is now I I I overuse the word legend. I mean, people laugh at me. Why? You know, no, this isn't a. People get self-conscious. I'm not a legend, or what I did is not legendary. Well, whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah. There were a lot of good comics in that.
yeah, there's Kaz,
This
of
is
course.
Kaz's strip. Yeah.
And,
From that issue. That was a Mark Newgarden cover, by the way.
uh, and then there's more of the development of Sam the Snowman.
Yeah. Yes, correct. Correct.
And
Name
then
change.
this one, which
David
is
Sandlin.
yeah, who's now a painter. I think he's
Of
completely
course.
moved over to just painting, and maybe like kind of in the spirit of Sue Ko, maybe.
Maybe. I always thought of him more as a fine artist than a cartoonist, though, simply because like uh I wasn't referring disparagingly when I was saying that that Pascal Dury work was not comics. All I really meant was essentially it doesn't really have dialogue balloons. Its narrative is either fractured or only partially important. And I would say that about most of David Sandlin's work too, is that the narrative is not driving it in the way that a comic strip will really be driven by its narrative usually. And it seems to me much more obvious that with Sandlin, you know, he's a painter, and that's his meat. That's what he is essentially. And in doing something like this, he's basically painting, but it's black and white. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
it's much more stream of consciousnessy than, you know, what one might think of as a comic. You know, that's not a criticism, by the way. You know, the work is wonderful. Um, yeah, but yeah, I guess I can see that a little bit. I can see that it's a little bit similar to Suko in certain respects. What happens, I think, is that a lot of artists are drawn to the medium of comics and work with it. They are not necessarily drawing comics. They're working with the medium, you know, as
Are-
painters sometimes, some cases.
I guess it's hard to, you can't avoid comics being sequential art.
Right. Um, Generally speaking, that's the way it goes. And another thing that I heard once, and this was at SVA, and I found this kind of fascinating, is that comics are essentially a moral medium. And uh, I thought that was a very interesting idea, that you almost can't escape from there being a moral clause. Like, you know, when Charlie Brown's trying to kick the football and he misses, the moral aspect of that is shame on me, shame on you. You know, the fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you, blah blah blah, all that.
Yeah.
And with all the Dick Tracy comics, there was always that morality thing. And you know, there's always something in a comic where you're seeing that somebody fucked up and they're paying the price for it. It was always the case in crime comics, and it may not always be true, but it seems to happen more often than not, that comics have that going on in them, is a kind of morality tale thing. It could just be in their DNA from the era in which they grew up, but that's definitely a piece of it, you know. Morality always finds its way into comics.
Yeah, I'll have to give that some more thought and see how often it applies. And here's one last.
It rarely doesn't. Um, yeah, this Mark Beyer comic from the third issue of Snake Eyes. I mean, this guy is really one of my favorite artists. I I almost don't know where to start. I love the graphics. I love the layout. I love the characters. I love the childlike feel of a lot of it, and the way that he has of his work never being horrifying, you know, in spite of some of the may that can happen in his comics and then they usually get brought back away. So it's not like horror comics anyway,
Yeah.
but amazingly original and really beautiful, you know. He gets compared to Rory Hayes sometimes, you know, the 1960s underground cartoonist. Are you familiar with his work at all?
No, I don't think
Rory
so.
Hayes. Yeah, Rory Hayes used to do horror comics, and he was very primitive and stylistically, on the surface, it looks a bit like Mark Beyer, but there's nothing psychotic here at all. This is fine art comics in the best possible way. Rory Hayes was like working out a lot of psychosis and meth addiction. He was a speed freak, but yeah, I really love comics where the voice becomes somehow purified, and this would only work, this kind of primitive drawing, actually how you see, or something like it. If you tried to draw this way, it would just look phony and pretentious, but this is Mark Beyer's voice, so it works, you know.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cartoonists have they can't help it, but they develop their own signature style that their people recognize the cartoon, say that's by this person or that person. I've I've experienced that so many times in different ways.
Sure. Right. If they're doing it right.
Now I have the perfect last question for you, and I'm so proud of the fact that I was able to ask it, because it's due to the fact that I kept looking and looking at different interviews, and there's one interview that you make reference to the fact that you're working on something that's going to be even bigger than Chicago. And recently you said that you're doing something that's, you said it is going to be a trilogy. And
Right.
in an interview that I just listened to last night with Gil Roth, who's amazing,
Yeah.
you go into details on this one story about a friend of yours from Britain, and
Yeah.
he has a tragic ending. And is that the third part of the story, or?
It is. It is. Yeah. That's a book that I've been working on since I finished Chartwell Manor, and there was a real kind of lag time because of COVID happening, and who knew what was going to happen. But I was done with the book with Chartwell Manor, and I just needed to get it cleaned up. And in the interim, I really wanted to work on my next project, which was very important to me. All these books are, I wouldn't do them. They're too much work to do unless it's a matter of life and death for me. So um, the third one, as I was saying, it's all about peeling the onion back and how far can you go. And this one, yeah, it's about my best friend's death, or at least that is, I guess, what you'd call the scaffolding, the skeleton for the book. When I lived on the Lower East Side, this this guy moved into my building, and we became friends. And it's a classic case of stranger comes to town, upends everyone's life, because that's what happened here. He was this kind of English expat hipster type, and he worked in construction and died doing construction. I knew him for almost exactly 2 years, and uh, it was kind of a complicated friendship. I didn't always like the guy, but still we were friends. And this is the kind of thing that happens when you're in your early 20s, you know what I mean? And like,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
you don't think things through in terms of who you hang out with. You just suddenly end up hanging out with them, and there you are. So there was a lot of that. And I've had the good fortune in my life for the most part, even during the 80s, uh, possibly because I'm straight, but I didn't know people who were, dropping like flies because of AIDS. The point being, I didn't know anybody who died out of nowhere except him. And he was a very vibrant character, a very lively personality, and a big personality. And the last person on earth you didn't think was going to be here next week. And suddenly, out of nowhere, he's not been here since. So that had a profound impact on me. And it, as I say, is the scaffolding for the next book, because that alone obviously wouldn't be enough for a story. People live and die all the time. But the impact that it had, as well as uh, the emotional things that were going on in my life when I was 23, all the way up to the point when he died. Uh, what I guess I'll say is that this next book will allow for the greater interiority that I'm really seeking. I mean, the thing about comics that's great, uh, it, it's got the potential to have the best of different possible worlds. Like you can have great interiority in a book, but you got no visuals, and you can have great visuals in a movie, but you don't tend to have that much interiority. There are exceptions, like uh, where voiceover actually works well, like in Goodfellas, for instance. The voiceover is very successful. Uh, it's not usually used because the medium is thought to be, purely visual. So, but with comics and with the graphic novel, you can really go there. Like you can go deeply into a character and a character's experiences, which I think I did in Chartwell Manor. But the action in Chartwell Manor becomes the content, meaning the content is very simple of my character being thrown across the room by my headmaster, pissing his pants, or it's very simple, him driving out of control on PCP and alcohol. What you see is what you get. That doesn't mean there aren't moments of introspection in the book, but I'm going to be able to go a lot further than that in the next book, into moments of really kind of deconstructing sanity and madness and family issues. So that's the next book, and I've been hard at work on it really for over a year, and I've got about 80 pages of it penciled and another 20 that are partly penciled, and the whole book is written. So that's the book. There's a lot that I didn't just mention that is really underpinning the book, but that's what I'm telling you right now.
Well, it's an exciting
But
time. It's an exciting time for you.
yeah, it is. It is. I really love doing this work, and I feel more at home and more excited by doing the work that I'm doing than I ever did at any other time when I was doing comics. I feel like a lot of decades were spent learning and developing and finding my voice. And I feel most at home doing the work that I've been doing. Like, I've been asked a lot, what was it like drawing Chartwell Manor? Was that like really painful and difficult? And that is and that's an understandable question because it's difficult material. But the actual fact of it, of drawing it, was that it was very enjoyable, surprisingly. And some of that may just relate to uh, the simple fact of, as a child, you can see. And a lot of what Chartwell Manor is about, especially that first chapter, is people with no agency in the midst of a tyrant, right?
Yeah.
So understandably, if you get to a point where you've got your drawing chops down and you can turn it around on that tyrant and you get to have the agency and he doesn't, well, that's going to be kind of enjoyable.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, I think it was. And there's also, like, for me, I think that the whole idea of truth telling in comics was probably ultimately what I was most taken by without always realizing it. You know, you can be pulled into comics like, say, Crumb, as I was, just for the pure joy of his cartooning, for his covers and for the energy of those styles and for that synthesis of different cartoon voices that he somehow made his own. And that's a thrill. But I noticed that over the years, the things that most stayed with me by him is not necessarily all of that fun stuff, aside from the covers, but the deeply personal autobiographical stuff that he did. That's the stuff that I really remember. That stuff really stays in my mind in ways that the other stuff doesn't. Like, I remember it, of course, and I love it, but it doesn't have as deep an impact for me as the really personal narrative stuff that he did. It just, I think of that stuff and it instantly is in my head, and I know, the specifics of those stories. That's how they affect you. And I think that's what personal work can do, is that it's a more unmediated thing in comics when you're telling your own story. I don't know that that's true with the written word, but it can really seem that way in comics.
Yeah. What's interesting about the written word is you can get away with certain things that you can't get away with in comics because you can hide behind all these words. And that's what I've noticed. That you can, there's certain things you can say, but you maybe don't mean to be racist, but you can get away with a lot of shit in the deep, deep inside a novel that you're it's not gonna, you can't see it right away in a comic.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
It may. I mean, it depends on the words used, and it depends on the way people are these days, because sometimes people respond very, very harshly to anything that might be racist, you know.
Yeah.
One of my wife's favorite words is niggardly, and it really is a good word, but don't dare use it. You know what I mean, in this day
Yeah.
and age. But it's a good word. I even forget what specifically it means. It's a certain kind of cheapness or small-mindedness or something. But you know, um, yeah. I mean, with comics, you're definitely putting it all out there in a different way. It's a completely different experience to read a book like Chartwell Manor, um, the way I've written and drawn it, as opposed to what it would be like to just, you know, read it in its words. You know, it wouldn't convey as much. It wouldn't have the same impact. And you can flow through a comic in a way that you can't. A comic can be more of a ride in a lot of cases than a book will be. You know what I mean? Because you've
Yeah.
got to convert those words into what those words mean to you. You don't have to convert anything when you're reading a comic, which is one reason why it was always thought to be an idiot's, you know, medium. I mean, for kids, that, like, you know, you could be illiterate practically and still read Nancy or Dick Tracy, and like wasn't thought to be very demanding. You know, it did a lot of the work for you,
Yeah.
which is fine. You know, I mean, movies do a lot of the work for you too. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, so.
Well, we could go on and on. I think this is probably a good place to say goodbye. Maybe we can meet again.
Okay.
I'm so grateful for the time you spent on this interview. You've done so many. I think everyone who's done an interview that I've seen so many of these interviews, I'm really impressed. Everyone brings something to their interview. I think
Yeah.
I think it's all good.
Well, I'm really glad to do it, and I appreciate again your very well written review of Chartwell Manor in Chicago, because you went into the weeds with it, and that's what really, as a cartoonist who's doing ambitious work, and I am, I hope for. You know, I appreciate engagement, and so I enjoyed this interview for that reason too. You know, you know my stuff, and you brought up a lot of different material from, you know, my history. So it was real good. Very glad to do it.
All right. Well, thank you, Glenn.
Sure. Well, thank you, Henry. Glad we got to talk.